Waiting should be over for game console fanatics, but it's not. PlayStation 2 went on sale at midnight, but only 165,000 have been shipped over, and they were all pre-booked. Sony reckons it's working overtime to make more units.
May 29th, 1991. Standing on platform 21, waiting to board the 8 a.m. Shinkansen, was a man by the name of Ken Kutaragi, the leader behind a partnership between Sony, a company that only 8 years ago was being touted as dead in the water, and Nintendo, the leading game console manufacturer, having most recently released the follow-up to their smash hit Famicom, the Super Famicom. About 3 years prior, Kutaragi had secretly developed a sound chip, the SPC700, that would be used for the Super Famicom. And after gaining support from Norio Oga, Kutaragi and Sony delved further into the video game market by partnering with Nintendo to create the Super Famicom CD-ROM, also known as the Nintendo PlayStation. As he waited for their train to Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto, Kutaragi began to think about the possibilities this new partnership would bring. He thought back to his 2-year-old son picking the Famicom over the MSX when both were laid out in front of him, and the G system he saw that was capable of real-time 3D texture mapping, and the endless possibilities the gaming landscape had. Then Nobuyuki Aide, director of public relations at Sony, approached with a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. Within moments, Kutaragi's world and his job hung in the balance. "What? You can't be serious," Kutaragi exclaimed, reading the memo after hearing the news. Hopping on the train still heading to Kyoto, Aide and Kutaragi rented a private compartment to discuss what they had just read. They called everyone they could, but no one was able to confirm or deny what they had just been told. Nintendo has torn up its contract with Sony and joined forces with Philips instead, Aide explained. This meant the Super Famicom CD-ROM would not hit the market. Everything Kutaragi had been working for began to vanish. Having arrived at Kyoto, Aide and Kutaragi made their way to Nintendo's headquarters, meeting with Minoru Arakawa, then president of Nintendo of America, to confirm the news. "It's true," Arakawa stated. He would not give any more information to the pair, and simply stated that Sony would, quote, honor the agreement, end quote. Kutaragi wouldn't give up, and within a few years, the Sony PlayStation would end up becoming the best-selling home console on the market. Bringing his vision to life, Kutaragi had an even grander vision for the future of PlayStation, a vision that would be a set-top black box made to fit in with the rest of the family's living room. That vision? The PlayStation 2. Having covered the 3 major consoles of the 5th generation and the Dreamcast, GameCube, and Xbox of the 6th generation, I felt that it was finally time to finish up the 6th generation and take a look at the history of the PlayStation 2. By the end of the fiscal year 1999, the PlayStation had sold over 50 million units. Introduced in 1994, Sony had spun off what they had developed for Nintendo into their own 32-bit console, and 5 years later it paid off big time. Nintendo decided to delay their Ultra 64 until 1996, and their decision to stick with cartridges, along with other issues, helped Sony gain dominance early with little competition from the 16-bit era. By 1998, the Nintendo 64 had sold 15.22 million units, and Sega, with the Saturn, only hit around 9 million units by the time it got discontinued in the US and Europe in 1998, proving that no matter the competition, Kutaragi and the team at Sony made smart choices with the PlayStation. To kick off the 6th generation of consoles, Sega was gearing to launch the Dreamcast, with the console's release date set for November 1998 in Japan. PlayStation users and gamers around the world were eagerly waiting for what Sony had in store. Like many video game consoles, the PlayStation 2 had secretly entered development sometime near the release of the PlayStation in 1994. According to a Letters column in Next Generation issue 22, little is known about the PlayStation 2, except that PlayStation chipmaster Ken Kutaragi has been working on the machine practically since the original hit the shelves, indicating that around the industry it was known that Sony was all in on the PlayStation and willing to create a follow-up with Ken Kutaragi at the helm once again. Though it seems the original hardware for a PlayStation 2 was almost made outside of Japan. Argonaut Software, developers behind the Super FX chip for games such as Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, was originally one of the companies in the running to develop the chipset for Sony's newest system. Jez San told PushSquare.com, "We were working for LSI Logic at the time. They had just invested in Argonaut, and part of the deal was they wanted us to design something for them. LSI were the fabricators of the original PlayStation 1 chip for Sony, and so were well placed to bid for the PlayStation 2 rendering chip, and wanted to compete along with several other designers. They used us to design it for them." According to San, LSI simply told Argonaut what the specs were that Sony wanted, specifically how many polygons per second. Quote, "So we designed a chip that did that, and it was damn good. Argonaut was so incredibly proud of the chip they produced, they named it Tadger, or possibly even Todger, though in the interview with PushSquare.com, he couldn't remember which. Because it was a dog's bollocks," recalled San. While the Argonaut team had developed a quick chip, Sony had been warping the narrative to LSI and other companies that were in the bidding. They were designing their own chip in-house. They designed their chip to be faster than the spec that they told everyone else to design. And while it's possible that Argonaut could have produced a chip that was leagues better than what they presented, that wasn't quite as cost-effective, explained San. "A little bit bigger is a lot more expensive. You don't put extra silicon in your chip if you don't need it. You design to your costs. If we had been told to design to that spec, to the correct spec, we would have done it. Or if they had told us the best chip will win, not the one that is to the spec they asked for, then we would have designed it faster." According to Argonaut and San, someone misled them, whether that be LSI Logic misleading Argonaut or Sony misleading LSI, no one will know. The reason behind it is also just a guessing game, but either way, Argonaut couldn't blame Sony entirely since they were never in direct touch with the company. They were just given orders that were passed down by LSI Logic. With Sony developing their own chip internally, what's the point of contacting multiple companies for them to bid on a chip? And why give them specifications that wouldn't match their own internal chip? Well, it could have to do with how Sega was approaching the Dreamcast. Instead, opting for more off-the-shelf parts, including the 3DFX Voodoo 2 graphics chips and the VideoLogic Power VR2, which is what they ended up with. However, Sega had two internal teams led by different engineers that ended up proposing their configurations to the higher-ups at Sega. Sony could have been wanting a similar approach, and Kutaragi, being the chipmaster he was, didn't want too intense of competition, so giving outside companies lower specs would end up making the internally developed chip look much better, forcing Sony to choose the in-house chip. This in-house chip would be titled the Emotion Engine. Phil Harrison stated in an interview with Eurogamer that the idea that Kutaragi and his team of engineers established was that the CPU would be capable not just of number crunching, but of delivering the kind of mathematical capability required to simulate emotion. This CPU was once again the child of Kutaragi, with Kutaragi forming a secret alliance and company with Toshiba, though no formal announcement or information would be available to the public until the console's announcement. By 1997, the PlayStation 2 was presumably still in development, and Next Generation magazine gave an update on not only the Saturn II, but also the PlayStation 2, claiming, "The 64-bit PlayStation follow-up is allegedly being developed in the west coast of the US by former members of Argonaut. The new hardware allegedly uses a 4-speed CD-ROM and has a larger RAM capacity than the existing PlayStation." Further on, they stated it will run a custom R4000 chip and would be able to play DVDs, adding in that, because of the success of the PlayStation 64 is unlikely to appear before 1998. And to encourage upgrading and maintain customer loyalty, it's likely to be compatible with the 32-bit machine, teasing the fact that the PS2 would end up with backwards compatibility. During the design phase, Sony would end up taking inspiration from an Atari machine that was never released. The machine, based on the Atari Falcon box or Falcon 030, was titled the Micro Box and was initially a version of the Falcon 040 that never made it to market. The Microbox has several similarities to the final PlayStation 2 design, mainly the tower-like design with the ridges, though the Microbox had a similar idea to allow for two different ways to display the device, a vertical and horizontal fashion. In a 1998 interview with Next Generation, Phil Harrison, then Vice President of Third-Party Relations and R&D, would tell Next Generation that Sony was more focused on creating better software tools, API, etc., for the current PlayStation, rather than focusing on new hardware. Phil would even flat out state that, quote, "At this point we have no plans to change our current technology," adding, "It would be premature to discuss the PlayStation 2 because, as I said, we're still just scratching the surface of the PlayStation as it exists today." Though an interesting tidbit from this interview would be Harrison's comment on the PlayStation format, stating, "It was designed on two solid premises. One, that it would be the creative choice of the development community, and equally important was that it would be the commercial choice of managers and sales and marketing executives of the software publishers. You could deliver the development community the most incredible technology, but if there wasn't a compelling installed base or hope of an installed base, nobody would support it." As speculation and hype continued to build for the PlayStation 2, the industry would finally get an answer in March of 1999. On March 2nd, in a stuffy concert hall located in Tokyo, Japan, a room of journalists, industry veterans, fans, and analysts alike crowded around, waiting to hear what they knew was coming. Finally, Norio Oga and Nobuyuki Aide took the stage, announcing to Japan, but soon to be the world, the PlayStation 2 did in fact exist. A fact many knew already, but until official word came out, it simply wasn't true. Among Oga and Aide, Sony Computer Entertainment President Teruhisa Togunaka and Ken Kutaragi would also speak. The four men first talked about the known success of the PlayStation. Having sold over 50 million units, over 400 million pieces of software, it was apparent Sony won this generation. And with their next announcement, they were likely to continue this momentum. Kutaragi confirmed a few tidbits that had been rumored, like the fact that the PlayStation 2 would be backwards compatible, something that up until that point wasn't common in follow-up consoles. They would also announce that it was indeed using the new DVD-ROM technology, and that it would be using a new in-house processor titled the Emotion Engine, a one-of-its-kind 128-bit processor. They claimed the PS2 could hit up to 75 million polygons, a number that was not initially believed by guests that had been invited, though with effects turned on, lighting, texturing, etc., that would bring it down to around 20 million polygons. Using DVD-ROM technology, Sony also showed off some demos, including a look at Tekken 4, a ball dance scene from Final Fantasy VIII, a Namco demo of Raiko Nagase of Ridge Racer 4, and a scene of Crash Bandicoot being chased. No specific release date or price was given, but a range of winter of 1999 to spring of 2000 was given, with a North American release date of fall 2000. The price was also estimated to cost around 50,000 yen or less. They made it a point to let everyone know that more information, including a price and a specific release date, would be coming soon, either at Tokyo Game Show or E3. Sony also made a call for companies to create development systems for the console, with some companies including Wavefront, Angel Studios, Metro Works, Autodesk, and Softimage already signing on to help create what Sony would call middleware. These development systems seem to be exactly what they sound like, a way for some developers to use software created by Autodesk or Softimage to help create software for the PS2 without getting too technically involved with the Emotion Engine. Shortly after the presentation, Sony Computer Entertainment America would make a similar announcement. Borrowing all of the talking points that SCE Japan made, there was no new information revealed within their conference call, though Phil Harrison was quick to call out that the Emotion Engine was the first 128-bit processor in the world, which was developed in conjunction with Toshiba. Harrison also gave a direct answer to whether or not the PS2 would play DVD movies, stating that while the PS2 had the ability to decode MPEG-2, the ability to play movies hadn't been implemented, and Sony was unsure whether they wanted to do it. The American division also stated that a modem or any other internet capability was not going to be announced, though they were considering it given the current landscape of internet connectivity. They stressed that more information on the console would be revealed at Tokyo Game Show and E3, much like SCE Japan announced. But they did state the hardware would not be shown at the March Tokyo Game Show. While they didn't show off the hardware, they did give the official specifications of the Emotion Engine, which were as follows. 128-bit CPU with a 300 MHz clock rate, 32 megabit direct RAM bus system memory, 3.2 gigabits per second of bus bandwidth, included a coprocessor titled the FPU, one floating point multiply accumulator and one floating point divider, two vector units, VU0 and VU1, a floating point performance rate of 6.2 gigaflops, 66 million polygons per second of 3D CG geometric transformation, and an MPEG-2 compressed image decoder. As for the graphics, they titled it the Graphics Synthesizer, which had a clock rate of 150 MHz. DRAM bus bandwidth of 48 gigabytes per second and a DRAM bus width of 256 bits, a pixel configuration of RGB alpha Z buffer 24832, and a maximum polygon rate of 75 million polygons per second. The sound chip was simply the SPU2 plus CPU, which had ADPCM, 48 channel on SPU2 plus definable by software, and a sampling frequency of 44.1 kHz or 48 kHz. The device included the current PlayStation CPU, which was a LSI CoreWare CW33300 based core for the I/O processor, having a clock rate of 33.8 MHz or 37.5 MHz, a 32-bit sub bus, and multiple interface types, including IEEE 1394, USB, and communication via PC card PCMCIA. A March 4th press release by Toshiba announced their joint venture with Sony to create the Emotion Engine, and detailed a little bit more about the design and capabilities of this new chip, with Toshiba also announcing that it was the first 128-bit CPU, and that it would be using a new production line using 0.18 to 0.15 micron process technology. The press release also included information on their new joint venture, including the ownership stakes, 51% Toshiba and 49% Sony Computer Entertainment International, and the initial capital priced at 100 million yen, with Toshiba stating Sony had prepared to invest 50 million yen. A few days before the fall Tokyo Game Show, Sony would come out with details on their sequel console on September 13, 1999. The console would officially be named the PlayStation 2, with the controller being dubbed the DualShock 2, and players would get a look at its sleek, tower-like design, with the fact that it could be placed vertically or horizontally, being a key selling point. A price of 39,800 yen would be the Japanese pricing, with NA and PAL regions getting their price tags at later dates. Sony also officially announced that the PS2 would be getting DVD movie playback support. The PS2 would be one of, if not, the cheapest DVD player on the market, helping set up the console for success before it was even released. While a modem or online connectivity wasn't confirmed for launch, Sony did mention it and described it as something they were working on. They showed more of the PS2's capability at the Tokyo Game Show, which was then only a few days away. September 17th through the 19th, 1999 would mark the 4th Tokyo Game Show, which first began in 1996, and it was at the conference center Makuhari Meisei where Sony continued to pull back the curtain on their new 128-bit console, one that fans were eager to get their hands on. The first step to build hype was to show off the power of the Emotion Engine by giving playable demos of launch titles, which included Tekken Tag Tournament, Gran Turismo 2000, The Bouncer, Street Fighter EX3, Eternal Ring, Kessen, Popolocroy 3, Dark Cloud, Unison, Drum Mania, Densen Electric Lines, and A-Train. Some other features that were shown in a promotional video include an 8 megabit memory card, blue discs, polygons, front loading, and more. On stage, Ken Kutaragi also gave an official launch date of March 4th, 2000 for the console, effectively ending any hype the Dreamcast had mustered with nearly a year on the market. The more impressive looking demos were definitely Gran Turismo 2000 and Tekken Tag Tournament, showing off impressive modeling, texture work, and lighting. What really mattered to Sony during this time was ensuring they recaptured the spark of the PS1. With Sony joining and then subsequently winning the 5th generation with the PS1, it was due to their marketing, their willingness to work with third parties, and their overall smart decision making that made the first console a success. No other console manufacturer would be able to strike twice with their consoles. Even with Nintendo winning the 8-bit and 16-bit eras, the SNES sold less than the NES sold, and the Nintendo 64 sold even less than the Super Nintendo. The Saturn sold far less than the Genesis had, and at this point, every other manufacturer was practically out of the market due to these failures. This determination drove the Japanese, American, and European subdivisions of Sony Computer Entertainment to go all in with the PlayStation 2. Though during all of this, there were rumors floating around that maybe the PlayStation 2 wasn't all it cracked up to be. Industry veteran Keiji Inafune, known for the Mega Man franchise, stated that the hardware was so powerful it was difficult to budget and design for. Not a bad problem to have for sure, but his colleague Shinji Mikami, director of the first Resident Evil game, would go even further and point out a lack of development tools for the console, making it difficult to even make games for the system. Some developers were even pointing to the lack of anti-aliasing and the lack of dedicated VRAM as being larger issues than previously thought. The PS2 was given a price and a Japanese release date before E3, with no further mention being given regarding a worldwide release, so Japanese players would get to play it first, with no other big developments between Tokyo Game Show 1999 and the March 4th Japanese release.
There is a price to pay for everything you gain.
On March 4th, 2000, the Sony PlayStation 2 officially hit Japanese store shelves. Sticking to that originally announced price of 39,800 yen, the launch titles in Japan were as follows: A-Train 6, Eternal Ring, Kessen, Mahjong Takai 3, Millennium League, Ridge Racer 5, and Street Fighter EX 3. Neither Tekken Tag Tournament or Gran Turismo 2000 would make it for the Japanese launch, with both titles getting delayed into later that year. Nearly 10,000 people sat in line, waiting to get their hands on the next generation. PlayStation's website couldn't keep up with demand, with it constantly crashing during the pre-order period. Most consoles sold on launch day were in fact pre-ordered, but some stores still had supply on a first-come, first-served basis. Within days, the black market had been flooded by PlayStation 2s, charging up to $2,000. By the end of the day, Sony had managed to sell around 600,000 consoles, even managing to sell over 900,000 units by the end of March 5th, only one day after. By the end of the month, they had sold through their entire stock of 1.4 million consoles. Though the unfortunate reason for the huge demand wasn't necessarily because of the new graphics or incredible games available, it was simply due to the DVD player. At 39,800 yen, around 370 USD, the PlayStation 2 was one of the cheaper DVD players on the market, and it could obviously play games as well. Prior to 2000, DVD players could go up to around $1,000 in price, with the mean landing somewhere around $450. In fact, according to Shohei Yoshida, The Matrix on DVD was the best-selling piece of software for the PlayStation 2 at launch, and general supply issues were a casualty of the highly anticipated release. The Japanese government even got involved, but only because they thought the emotion engine was so powerful, they were afraid it was going to be used for targeting systems by foreign adversaries. Even though the PS2 didn't exactly have stellar launch titles, and rumors were swirling that the console wasn't the best or easiest to develop for, the PlayStation 2 was flying off of Japanese store shelves, a good sign of things to come when they finally released in Europe and North America. But first, Sony had to make it through the hottest gaming event of the year, E3. From May 11th through the 13th, the current three duked it out at the Electronic Entertainment Expo. Nintendo announcing their new console, the GameCube, for a fall 2001 release date, Sega continuing to support the Dreamcast against the might that was the PlayStation 2, and finally Sony, who would unveil a brand new game in a hit tactical espionage series. but also give final details on the North American release of their hit console. However, there would be one more company joining the race, turning the current 3 into the final 4. Microsoft would join in, announcing the Xbox, a radical new console hitting living rooms in 2001, directly competing against Nintendo. The biggest draw from the Sony booth was, of course, Metal Gear Solid 2. The sequel to Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation, Hideo Kojima and Konami would be back for round 2, and most importantly, they'd be back to show off the power of the PlayStation 2 and the Emotion Engine. According to one IGN editor, it's really hard to describe in words the grandness of what was on display here. The bottom line is that based on what was shown, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, will likely be one of the most cinematic experiences of our time, in a video game or on film, and further gushed about the graphics, stating, "The game's graphics are simply the best we've seen on the system. Even though it does have some aliasing, it's not really a problem, and nobody in his right mind would dare complain about it." Closing out their thoughts, editor Dave Zadurko said, "Metal Gear Solid 2 appears to be well on the way to becoming the single best game on PlayStation 2, if not the greatest game of all time. While the Electronic Entertainment Expo has yet to officially finish, I'll go ahead and say it right now. Konami's Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty is the game of the show. There's just no way that another piece of software in the next 3 days will be able to top this, not on PlayStation 2, Dreamcast, or Nintendo 64, and definitely not on PlayStation." All eyes were on Metal Gear Solid 2 and how the PlayStation 2 could deliver such tantalizing visuals. The characters, the environment design, the AI, the gameplay capabilities, all were available on the PlayStation 2. Other titles for the PlayStation 2 included Fantavision, a puzzle game, Ridge Racer 5, Time Splitters, Armored Core 2, Ico, and more, which were revealed to be launch titles for North America. Fast forward to the North American release. Outside of a Best Buy in Atlanta, Georgia was Bobby Butler. A 34-year-old man camped outside all evening with his son, waiting to ensure they got a PlayStation 2. Unable to pre-order one, their only hope was that this Best Buy in particular had a few available. By the time the store opened up, they revealed they only had a limited number of consoles available for direct purchase. After waiting behind 95 other people, the 96th and final ticket was given to Butler, who had, quote, "sweated it out when they were counted off this morning. My daughter Ashley has leukemia, and this is all she wanted for Christmas," Bobby said, holding his PlayStation 2, the accessories he had gotten, and his stroller holding his infant son. The North American release date for the console was announced as October 26, 2000, and retailing at $299, nearly 7 months after the initial Japanese launch. A month before they were set to launch, Sony had to cut the amount of PS2s they were sending to the States in half, going from 1 million units to 500,000 units. Many of those sales were pre-orders, with who knows how many available for purchase at launch. With hundreds of people lined up across the country, CNN spoke to a few individuals waiting in line, including one who had pre-ordered their console after hearing about the intense sales situation that happened in Japan. One man, however, had bought it and already sold it on eBay for $600, planning to ship it overnight to their buyer. Another person they spoke with had bought the PS2 mainly for the DVD player, showing that the sentiment was similar in the States. The PlayStation 2 is a really cool gaming machine, but an even cheaper DVD player. At a different location near Atlanta, the police had to be called due to a fight breaking out after a Walmart location announced that they had only 21 consoles to sell. While every console launch is filled with issues, the PlayStation 2 had managed to sell over $250 million worth of consoles, accessories, and games in one day, beating the $97 million record the Dreamcast had set just 1 year earlier. Sony also sold through all the stock it had, meaning they moved 500,000 consoles in one day, another record they could notch on their belt. With the PlayStation 2 finally releasing in North America, Europe and Australia would have to wait until November 24th and 30th for their chance to get the console. The launch PlayStation 2 stands at a height of 3.1 inches, width of 11.9 inches, depth of 7.2 inches, and a weight of 4.85 pounds. The front I/O includes 2 controller ports, 2 memory card ports, with the standard memory card starting at 8 megabytes, 2 USB ports, and a FireWire 400 port. A small PlayStation 2 symbol on the front of the disc tray is turnable, meaning no matter the configuration of your console, it'll face the right way. And of course you have the power button, or reset button, and the eject button for the front-loading DVD-ROM. On the back you have the DC power port, the same one as the original PlayStation, an AV multi-out, also same as the original PlayStation, which could handle composite video, S-video, SCART, and YPB-PR. It included an SPDIF digital out port as well. The back of the console has a panel that you can pop up that allows you to fit a hard drive, and also reveals a PC card slot used for the network adapter and HDD. That's right, unlike the Dreamcast and later the Xbox, the PlayStation 2 paves the way for Nintendo and forgoes a built-in modem or Ethernet port, allowing players to purchase an adapter to plug in if they would like to play online. The case for the console, other than having similar design qualities to the Microbox, chose the black shell and blue gradient for the boxy PS2 on the top to represent Earth and space. According to Taiyu Goto, designer of the console, it's meant to be the blue hue of Earth sitting in the dark vastness of space. For accessories, we'll start with the DualShock 2, which is quite literally just a DualShock from the PlayStation 1, except the twin thumbsticks are now the standard, not the exception. With 4 shoulder buttons, 4 face buttons, start, select, D-pad, analog, and twin thumbsticks, Sony figured they hit a really good design with the original DualShock and decided to not change a thing. The biggest change is the new analog button, which enables analog mode. In some games, this allowed you to turn on and off analog control, namely Ace Combat 2 and Ridge Racer Type 4. We have the standard 8MB memory card, which can hold up to 8MB of saves, like the label says. Since the PlayStation 2 only released with 2 controller ports, Sony released a multi-tap, allowing up to 4 players to play games together. The PlayStation 2 also had 2 stands sold separately, a vertical and horizontal stand. Retailing for $14.99, the vertical stand allows users to place their PS2 in the vertical position without fear of it toppling over. While the PlayStation 2 didn't have out-of-box network capabilities, Sony would launch the PS2's online play service in July of 2001 for Japan, August of 2002 in North America, and June 2003 in Europe, and with it released the network adapter. The network adapter attaches to the back of the PlayStation 2 where the expansion slot is. The adapter itself also has a connector on it if you'd like to hook up an HDD, which would then slide into the HDD bay within the PlayStation 2's chassis. Under the hood of the PlayStation 2, we of course have the Emotion Engine, which is a SoC or system on chip, including the CPU and GPU. The actual CPU is a MIPS 3 R5900 based CPU that is clocked at 294.912 MHz, a few megahertz below the initial 300 MHz announced, with it being able to hit 299 on newer versions of the console. This R5900 CPU is a derivative of the R5000 CPU, but the R5900 was built specifically for Sony and the Emotion Engine, with Toshiba still having a MIPS licensee at the time. MIPS, of course, stands for Microprocessor Without Interlocked Pipeline Stages, and it's within the RISC, Reduced Instruction Set Computer Instruction Set Architectures. RISC simplifies the processor itself by efficiently implementing only the instructions that are frequently used in programs, while less common operations are simply subroutines. This R5900 version of the R5000 has enhancements specifically linked to 3D, including a 6-stage pipeline, 24 kilobytes of L1 cache divided into 16 kilobytes for instructions and 8 kilobytes for data, a memory management unit, 2 64-bit ALUs, and 32 128-bit general purpose registers. On the motherboard sits 2 16MB RAM modules, giving us that 32 megabytes of main memory. The buses linked between the main memory interface and the RAM modules are 16-bit 400 MHz, with a 128-bit 150 MHz bus going from memory interface to the CPU, engines, and DMA. Aside from the CPU itself, the VPUs, also known as vector processing units, are housed within the Emotion Engine itself. These processors are independent and are designed to operate vectors made for floats, while only spending 1 cycle per operation. In this image, we see the setup of how the CPU interacts with the 2 VPUs, titled VPU 0 and VPU 1. The CPU itself is in charge of providing the microcode for the VPUs. If you haven't watched my Nintendo 64 video, that machine also uses a MIPS-based CPU and used a lot of microcode as well, so here's the definition just in case. Microcode refers to the micro instructions, especially of a microprocessor, that govern the details of operation. VPU 0 itself has 2 modes of operation, micro mode and macro mode. Micro mode will execute micro instructions independently from a micro program stored in the micro memory. The macro executes macro instructions received from the CPU itself from that 128-bit bus. These instructions have the same functionality as micro instructions, but use different opcodes, and it mainly serves as a function to speed up the CPU's vector operations. VPU1, on the other hand, has 4 times the amount of micro memory and, unlike its brother, an EFU, elementary function unit, allowing the trigonometric and exponential functions to be sped up. This VPU is only operated in micro mode, thus only really being used for trigonometric operations. Located between VPU 0 and the graphics interface, the VPU 1 attempts to give the GPU math it just did as quickly as possible, having its own 128-bit bus. This allows for really good procedural generation and would prove to benefit things such as complex surfaces, world rendering including terrain, and Bezier curves, helping give the Emotion Engine that extra sense of realism compared to the already released Dreamcast. Developers could choose different types of design to implement the VPU1. For example, a parallel design uses the CPU simultaneously with the VPU 0 while main memory talks to VPU 1, and they both end up talking to the GPU. John Burton, former director of Traveler's Tales, details on his own channel plenty of great content regarding games he and his company worked on, but specifically in his video, Crash and LEGO Star Wars Impossible Effects, Coding Secrets, he details a particle system they had coded for Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex, LEGO Star Wars, and various other games. Implemented by Dave Dutzen, they were able to create a particle system capable of rendering over 17 million textured particles a second. This system ran entirely on the VPU, loading the VPU with every item that was common with the effect they chose, using more complex math, keeping that information on the VPU, and recalculating the position of the particle without sending information to the main CPU. The overall performance breakdown for the CPU itself is as follows: 6.2 gigaflops, 32-bit, FPU 0.64 gigaflops, VU 2.44 gigaflops, VU1 3.08 gigaflops. Geometric transformation, 150 million vertices per second. Raw 3D perspective, 66 to 80 plus million vertices per second. Peak bones, movements, effects, lights, 15 to 20 million vertices per second. Lighting, 38 million polygons per second. Fog, 36 million polygons per second. Bezier, 16 million polygons per second. Real-world performance, 500 to 600,000 at 30 FPS and 250 to 300,000 at 60 FPS, and 6,000 MIPS, million instructions per second. The GPU, or more specifically the graphics synthesizer, runs at 147.46 MHz, containing 4 megabytes of DRAM inside the system itself, allowing the graphics synthesizer to access it rather than main memory. The graphics synthesizer rasterizes the full image, generating pixels, texture mapping, lighting, etc. It has a fixed shading model, so if you choose, for example, Gorod shading, that's it. The graphics synthesizer is capable of variable output resolution starting at 256 by 224, going all the way up to 1920 by 1080. The 4 megabytes of DRAM is capable of hitting 48 gigabytes per second at peak bandwidth, with a texture buffer bandwidth of 9.6 gigabytes per second and a frame buffer bandwidth of 34.8 gigabytes per second. Pixel configurations range from RGB alpha, 24 by 8, 15 by 1, 16, 24, or 32-bit Z buffer. The pixel fill rate of the graphics synthesizer is 2.352 gigapixels per second, with it being reduced to 1.2 gigapixels per second with Z buffer, alpha, and texturing. Texture fill rate was at 1.2 gigatexels per second. Overall polygon draw rate was at 75 million per second, going down to 50 million per second at 48 pixel quad with Z buffer and alpha, 30 million per second at 50 pixel triangle with Z buffer and alpha, 25 million per second 48 pixel quad with Z buffer, alpha, and textures, and finally 16 million per second at 75 pixel triangle with Z buffer, alpha, textures, and fog. And here are effects that the graphics synthesizer include: bump mapping, MIP mapping, spherical harmonic lighting, alpha blending, alpha text, transparency effects, post-processing effects, perspective correct texture mapping, bilinear and trilinear texture filtering, flat shading, Gorod shading, cell shading, dithering, and more. The audio processor is the SPU2, an upgrade over the PS1's SPU1, with Core 0 and Core 1 both clocked at 36.86 MHz. each processing 24 channels of sound. It has 2 megabytes of sound memory with 48 hardware channels of 80 PCM, plus software mix definable programmable channels. Digital effects include pitch modulation, envelope, looping, and digital reverb. It supports MIDI instruments and could load up to 512K of sampled waveforms. You could output sound for Dolby Digital 5.1, surround sound DTS, though that's for full motion video only, and some later games encoded 5.1 surround sound during gameplay using Dolby Pro Logic 2. The fact that the original PlayStation CPU, the MIPS R3000A, is inside the PlayStation 2 is what helped allow for the PlayStation 2 to have 100% backwards compatibility for original PlayStation games. When a PlayStation 1 disc is inserted into the console, Sony boots up a PS1 emulator, which downclocks the MIPS R3000A to run at the PS1's original clock speed, and the console then uses the Motion Engine to emulate the PS1's GPU, and the SPU2 remaps itself to the original SPU1. Finally, the disk drive is a 24-speed CD-ROM, or a 4-speed DVD-ROM that is region-locked. Games themselves are of PlayStation 2's CD-ROM format, with PlayStation 2 DVD-ROM format coming at a later date. The drive itself does support DVD-5, which has a single layer capacity of 4.7 GB, and DVD-9, which is a dual layer with a capacity of 8.5 GB. For comparisons between its other 6th gen counterparts, here are the raw numbers. For Matrix flops, we have the Dreamcast's Hitachi SH4 at 1.4 gigaflops, the Motion Engine at 5.5 gigaflops, the Xbox's NVIDIA NV2A at 5.8 gigaflops, and the GameCube's Flipper at 7.5 gigaflops. At 4 light sources, the Dreamcast is capable of 6.8 million polygons per second, the PS2 at 9.8 million polygons per second, the Xbox at 16 million polygons per second, and the GameCube at 20 million polygons per second. Flops aren't everything when it comes to real-world performance though. For example, one of the big advantages the PS2 has is its buffering bandwidth. For frame buffer and Z buffer, the Dreamcast is at around 12.8 gigabytes per second, 12 gigabytes per second in Z buffer, and 800 megabytes per second frame buffer. The PS2, on the other hand, is at a whopping 38 gigabytes per second for both Z buffer and frame buffer. The GameCube and Xbox land at 9.6 gigabytes per second and 5.3 gigabytes per second respectively. Texture buffering is a similar story, with the GameCube landing on top. Dreamcast is at 800 megabytes per second, compressed is 6 gigabytes per second, 9.8 gigabytes per second for the PlayStation 2, 10 gigabytes for the GameCube, and the same 5.3 gigabytes per second for the Xbox, since the frame, Z, and texture buffering are all shared. Overall, the PS2 is quite a bit more powerful than the ill-fated Dreamcast, but it's not quite on the same level as the GameCube or Xbox. But it did make it to market a year before both of those consoles. Note, this is all theoretical, maximum efficiency performance, and do not include in-game results. Trip Hawkins, CEO of 3DO at the time, said, "It's historic, a mass-market appliance that fundamentally changes society in the same way the printing press did. This is a new canvas for humanity that takes us back to our nature." Leading up to launch, Sony would dive into marketing for the PlayStation 2 in quite a few unorthodox ways, including odd print ads, a commercial directed by David Lynch of Twin Peaks fame, multiple other eerie commercials that, while many believe were by David Lynch, were actually directed by many other creatives in the industry. The intention was to create, quote, memorable by any means type of commercials, creating the slogan, "The Third Place," showing a world that broke rules, a world where anything could happen. Sony continued to target 17-year-olds with their marketing, with Jack Tretton, leader of Sony Computer Entertainment US, telling GamesIndustry.biz, "We had the exact audience in mind for PlayStation 2 that we did for PlayStation because it was so well targeted. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. We use the age of 17 as kind of the target of the bullseye, with the theory that everybody under 17 aspires to be 17 because of an older sibling, or you're going to have your driver's license. If you're older, you harken back on your teenage years." Sony didn't want to go for Nintendo's demographic, and by the time the PlayStation 2 was coming out, most everybody had heard of a PlayStation, so they wanted to continue driving up PlayStation's original demographics. Games released for the American launch of the PlayStation 2 are as follows: Armored Core 2, Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore, Dynasty Warriors 2, ESPN International Track and Field, ESPN X Games Snowboarding, Eternal Ring, Evergrace, Fantavision, Gun Griffin Blaze, Kessin, Madden NFL 2001, Midnight Club, MotoGP, NHL 2000, Orphan, Cue Ball Billiards Master, Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, Ridge Racer 5, Silent Scope, Smuggler's Run, SSX, Street Fighter EX3, Summoner, Swing Away, Tekken Tag Tournament, Time Splitters, Unreal Tournament, Wild Wild Racing, and X Squad. With an abundance of games available at launch, the issue wasn't the quantity of titles like it had been for previous console launches across the industry. This time it was the quality of titles. While there are plenty of good games within that launch title criteria, including Armored Core 2, Tekken Tag Tournament, Time Splitters, Ridge Racer 5, and a few more, there wasn't a specific system seller. It's very often that when a new console releases, especially through the 90s, it needed that specific game to really be a hit, or a game that really showed off the system's technical capabilities. The Nintendo 64 had Mario 64, the Xbox will eventually get Halo Combat Evolved, the Super Nintendo had Super Mario World, the Dreamcast had Sonic Adventure. However, as we've moved through the systems of the 6th gen and taken a look at some previous generation systems, it becomes increasingly clear that launch titles specifically don't really define a system. The PlayStation didn't launch with a ton of fanfare titles other than maybe Ridge Racer. Other than Mario 64, there was Pilotwings 64. The Genesis would launch with solid titles, but Sonic the Hedgehog wouldn't come out until 2 years after the Genesis launched in North America. The PlayStation 2 had a launch lineup that was so uninspiring that years later after it's launched, it's still being discussed as one of the worst launch lineups ever. According to Jonathan Farger, former PR manager at Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, in an interview with Eurogamer, some of the launch titles were okay, but they weren't, Fantavision. 3 weeks after Bonfire Night and we were launching a game about fireworks. We got away with a hell of a lot. At E3, we'd promised the world, basically. We'd promised games that would look like Toy Story. The games we delivered at launch, as with any platform, not so much. Even Phil Harrison didn't really believe in that launch lineup, stating in the same interview, "I don't think looking at the launch lineup, you would have extrapolated 148 million sales. It was a mixed bag. There was nothing there that you would have said was completely changing the way games were played." While games were a big question mark at launch, something that wasn't was the fact that it was a DVD player. The PlayStation 2 would sell with locations such as Southern Europe having marketing that would put the DVD player aspect on equal footing as it being a game machine. The DVD player would be one of the footnotes in America, but as GamesIndustry.biz describes, the PS2 is seen as the point where consoles left the bedroom and moved under the living room TV. People and families would purchase a cheap DVD player and then get hooked on the games. Children and teenagers would convince their parents to buy the PlayStation 2 so they could play games, but also because they wanted to watch movies. The PlayStation 2 would still be a success simply by numbers. Remember, it managed to move through the whole 500,000 unit stock in one day and eclipsed $250 million in sales within that first day. It was a huge success commercially from the beginning, but that didn't always spell success for Sony. Most consoles when they were released are sold at a loss because the development of the console and the hardware itself is normally more expensive to produce in the beginning. This would be the case for the PlayStation 2, with every console selling at a fairly significant loss. The biggest issue, however, was that with a lackluster lineup of games, the console wasn't bringing in very much revenue off of game sales. While Sony and Kutaragi continued to garner third-party support carried over from the development of the original PlayStation, development of games took longer, in part due to the higher fidelity and the lackluster tools Sony provided upon initial announcement and release of the PlayStation 2. Chris Deering, head of Sony Computer Entertainment Europe at the time, remembers, "I had a rough bit with Tokyo because we had a loss year in the PlayStation 2's first year. Everyone lost. But our loss was as big as the US and Japan combined. That was possibly because we sold more PS2s and they were all sold at a loss." Though with high sales of the console itself, the inclusion of backwards compatibility cannot be understated in how it allowed Sony to capture the living rooms of families and gamers alike. Gone were the days of having to fork over more money to experience the next generation and lose access to all the titles you've built up over the years. A good amount of consumers would end up trading in consoles to get the newest one, and this allowed players to keep their PlayStation 1 games. To quote Tretton, "Backward compatibility meant people didn't feel like the investment they had made in the previous 5 years was completely abandoned, and they had to dig into their pockets again to stay on top of where the games industry was headed." This also allowed multiple PlayStation consoles in the household, as Ray Maguire of Sony Computer Entertainment United Kingdom and Ireland Boss puts it. "My thinking was for people who had a PlayStation, there might be a sibling who was slightly younger who might get that once those people upgraded to a PlayStation 2. Then you have a house with more than one device, which is great, and stop squabbling over who can play. It's just a way of moving everything along." As the PlayStation lifespan began and worked through the rest of 2000, going through 2001, Final Fantasy X, releasing on July 19th, 2001 in Japan and December 18th, 2001 in North America, would end up being one of the console's first big hits, nearly selling 10 million units in its lifespan. With the hotly anticipated Grand Theft Auto 3 and Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty finally hitting the console in fall of 2001. In fact, with Nintendo and Microsoft gearing up to join the race, Sony's plan was to try and snatch up games to be exclusive to PlayStation 2, like GTA 3. At the time, Grand Theft Auto wasn't a super well-known franchise, so when Sony representatives were meeting with Take-Two, they offered a few games, and by the end of it had only mentioned Grand Theft Auto 3, with some of Sony's people saying it was innovative but not a monster. So Sony made a deal and nabbed Grand Theft Auto 3 as a console exclusive, and it quickly became one of the best-selling games of the year. It wasn't until the GameCube and Xbox began hitting the market that notable gems started to flood the PlayStation 2, including Jak and Daxter, the precursor Legacy, Crash Bandicoot, The Wrath of Cortex, Silent Hill 2, Devil May Cry, Ico, and many more. Along with hotly anticipated games for 2001, Sony also cut the price of the PlayStation 2 in Japan, cutting it down to 35,000 yen, and could have been a response to Nintendo's releasing the GameCube that year for only 25,000 yen, since Sony's announcement only came about a month after Nintendo announced the price of their newest console. Sony continued to move consoles, now with the ability to play show-stopping and beautiful pieces of gaming. By March 31st, 2001, before the GameCube and Xbox were even released, Sega dropped out of the console market, with the discontinuation of the Dreamcast. The GameCube released first on September 14th, 2001, and then the Xbox on November 15th, 2001. With the release of these consoles, the Big Three were established as the three companies who continue to make home consoles to this day. Though the GameCube and Xbox were received fairly well by consumers and industry insiders, the PlayStation 2 had a full year of gaining steam, especially with Sega dropping out. It had become unstoppable. The install base, due to the people purchasing in part due to the DVD player, made it impossible for studios to ignore it for third-party titles, and for a while it was the only next-generation console still on the market. The brand awareness and goodwill that Sony had built up with the PlayStation 1 and their continuance of that had paid off as well. By the end of March 31st, 2002, the PlayStation 2 would sell a cumulative 28.68 million units, and continued that trajectory with games such as Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, Ratchet & Clank, and the generational Kingdom Hearts, all releasing in 2002. With those and many more hitting the PS2 that year, the console sold over 20 million units, and by the end of March 31st, 2003, hit cumulative sales of 51.2 million consoles. The PlayStation 2 continually outpaced the sales of the original PlayStation and all other consoles that came before it, including the ones in its current generation. It was the right product at the right time and the right price. It was something everyone could get into easily, and there was a huge breadth of content. It went through age groups, and it had a great price. That's a difficult thing to say no to. Ray Maguire. The PlayStation 2 would go on to sell over 155 million consoles in its lifespan, a number that still stands to this day as the highest selling console of all time. By all accounts, it should have failed. The technical design of the console could produce wonderful results, but it was difficult to program for, was underpowered by comparison, and upon release, it just didn't have the tools necessary to develop efficiently for it. The launch lineup itself wasn't fantastic, with no real must-have games coming to the system until 2001, and even missing internet capabilities that the Dreamcast and eventually Xbox would have at launch. From what we as historians know of the Saturn, Wii U, Virtual Boy, and every other failed console, even the non-failures like the GameCube or Nintendo 64, the PlayStation 2 seemed to have all the signs of a flop. The difference? Sony had built such key marketing and such brand awareness with this marketing that the PlayStation 2 was just too big to fail. With the DVD player, the low price, and the goodwill that they had garnered from developers and consumers with the PlayStation 1, the PlayStation 2 towered over the competition, allowing it to reach new heights in its success. From its launch in 2000 to its worldwide discontinuation in 2013, having multiple different console revisions, a slim edition of the console eventually coming out, and many more hit games, it truly was a living room staple. Along with being the most successful console of all time, some words ring truest with the PlayStation 2. Since the move from the bedroom to the living room, this smart move by Sony executives and games like Ico, Metal Gear Solid 2, Shadow of the Colossus, and many, many more ushered video games into a new era of not just being a toy anymore, but being genuine, high-budget entertainment and art. Jack Tretton, in an interview with GamesIndustry.biz, would put it best. PlayStation 2 was the culmination of ushering in video games as a mainstream entertainment. People stopped questioning whether it was a fad that was going to go away and started to look at it as a legitimate entertainment medium on par with box office or the music industry. He was right. Whether it be due to the marketing, the heart of the games that were created, the DVD player, or the monolithic look of the console, consumers began to treat gaming seriously. The ones who grew up with a Super Nintendo or a Genesis, an NES or an Atari were older now, and being able to play these games in a new era helped continue this form of art and entertainment into the 21st century. Taken on its own, it might seem pretentious, but to call it the emotion engine was making a bold statement about what we were out to achieve, said David Wilson. While video games have always been a valid form of entertainment, it wasn't until Kutaragi disrupted the industry and created a console with heart and emotion at its core that video games were taken seriously in the general consumer landscape. Thanks for watching. Welcome new subscribers. I hope you enjoyed this extensive look and history into the PlayStation 2. I myself have never owned a PlayStation 2 up until I began scripting this video, and it really is an incredible console. I just want to say thank you for all of your love, support, and everything in between on these videos. Recently, my Donkey Kong 64 video started doing crazy, for me, numbers, and thank you all for watching it. I also thank you a ton for the community support, giving me your input on things, and just general support in ways that I couldn't even imagine. Also, thank you so much to Rodrigo Capetti for his PlayStation 2 architecture article. This has a lot of really great information. I'll put a link in the description, but a lot of this information on the PlayStation 2's CPU, GPU, VPU, all of that stuff comes from his article and other sources, of course. He does a great job of analyzing the PlayStation 2 as a computer system and how everything works together, so please go check out his article. By the way, did you know that less than 10% of you are subscribed to the channel? If you did subscribe, it would help out the channel a lot and I would greatly appreciate it. Also, I wanted to plug my Patreon. A link to it is in the description, and if you decide to support the show in that way, first off, thank you so much. Second off, you'll get access to some behind the scenes content and more from me. So if you enjoy what I do, that's a great way to help support the show and what I'm trying to achieve here. Well, that's all the time I've got. I gotta get back to playing Animal Crossing New Leaf on my Nintendo 3DS.